In this video, we're going to be covering serverless application development, and this is because Webiny is a serverless first product, which means it runs on serverless cloud infrastructure. And there are a couple of specifics when it comes to developing on it. So in the first part of this video, we're going to be covering serverless application development in general. And then in the second part, we're going to be covering how Webiny approaches it. So we did mention that Webiny is a serverless first product. And as we can see here, it relies on Amazon Cognito for storing user identities. It relies on Amazon S3 for storing files. And it also relies on AWS Lambda for running all of its application code. For more information, make sure to check our website, where you can find all of the information how these work together. When talking about serverless application development, usually what we refer to here is backend development, where our application is leveraging serverless services. But do note that front-end applications can leverage these too. For example, we might have a React application that's being served from an Amazon S3 bucket. Serverless application development is a little bit different when it comes to quote-unquote traditional application development, and in the next couple of slides we'll be covering some of these differences. First of all, local development is slowly fading away, and we're slowly moving to the development in the cloud. And this is essentially because developing on top of serverless services means developing on top of proprietary services that cannot be run locally. Sure, it might be possible to sort of emulate services like AWS Lambda or maybe Amazon S3, but the more and more we use different serverless services, this becomes much harder. Next up, we have event-driven architectures, and this basically means we are leveraging our cloud provider's event system, and we can react to different events that happen within the cloud provider. So for example, we might have an AWS Lambda function that gets triggered every time a file has been uploaded into our S3 bucket. There are more examples, of course. For example, we might also want an AWS Lambda function to be triggered every time a user has signed up or logged in into our application. We could also use something called DynamoDB streams to, for example, again, trigger an AWS Lambda function whenever data is inserted into our DynamoDB table. And finally, we will mention that developers are more responsible for cloud infrastructure changes. If we were to go back to our previous example where we had an AWS Lambda function being triggered whenever a file is being uploaded to our Amazon S3 bucket, we can see that it's not just about the application code. For example, when it comes to the function, we must ensure that enough RAM is allocated. We must ask ourselves, do we need any layers? Do we need provisioned concurrency enabled? And so on. We also ultimately must ensure that the Lambda function is called when a file is uploaded into our S3 bucket. And all of these configurations are done via cloud infrastructure code. Alright, now that we've covered some of the differences, let's see how Webiny approaches serverless application development. As a reminder, in the previous video, we mentioned that every Webiny project consists of 4 project applications located in our apps folder. So we have core, API, admin, and website. And all of these project applications consist of essentially 2 pieces. So it's the actual application. This might be our GraphQL API on the backend, or maybe our front-end React application. And also the underlying infrastructure, which is described through infrastructure code. In other words, with Pulumi. Where possible, Webiny tries to offer local or semi-local application development, and what this allows for is a much faster iteration. But when faced with a more complex requirement, like adding new cloud infrastructure resources, connecting them all together, then developing in the cloud is inevitable. In the previous video, we've already seen the Webiny deploy command in action, and in the following slides, we'll be introducing another command that will enable us to develop on top of Webiny. So let's see how backend and frontend application development works with Webiny. When it comes to backend application development, we are talking about 2 approaches. So we either use Webiny CLI's watch command, or we use something called semi-local development. So the first approach is to use Webiny CLI's watch command, which enables us to continuously build our application code as we're making changes to it and redeploy it into the cloud. And this approach is relatively straightforward because in a way it does emulate local development. As a quick example, let's imagine we are working on a custom GraphQL mutation. So we would do some code changes. Those code changes would get rebuilt and automatically deployed into our cloud. And with a simple GraphQL API, we should be able to trigger that mutation and see if the results are correct. So we're manually testing the changes we've made. This approach is also harder to debug, and this is not only because we cannot use a tool like a debugger, but also because every time we make a change, that change needs to be redeployed, and this process does take from 5 to 10 seconds sometimes. When it comes to tests, the only thing we can do here are automated end-to-end tests. So this is how the Webiny watch command works. We type in yarn Webiny watch, after which we specify the name of the project application, which in this case is API, and at the very end we still need to specify the environment we're working with. Once we run the Webiny watch command, we can see output similar to this. So in the above section, above the horizontal line, we can see all of our code compilation related messages and errors if there are any. And below the line, we can see our deployment status. At the moment, our code is being deployed, but soon enough, once the deployment has been completed, this deploying message will be changed to deployed. The second approach we can use when developing backend applications with Webiny is using this so-called semi-local development. It's called semi-local just because, despite the fact that the code is running on our local machine, it's still interacting with services that are previously deployed into your AWS account. In other words, we still need to perform the initial deployment so that our code can actually work. Essentially, this approach is made of just tests within which we are running our application code in the same way if it were to be deployed into our AWS cloud and be run from there. In many cases, this approach is more robust than using the Webiny watch command, just because we get to do a lot more with it. For starters, it's much easier to debug our code because we can use a tool like a debugger and inspect our code while it's running. Iterations are also much faster because we don't need to wait for deployments to be completed between the changes we are making. And finally, since we are already writing our code within jest context, we might end up with some integration tests along the way, or maybe even an end-to-end test. And that's really all to it when it comes to backend application development with Webiny. Sure, this was just a brief outline of how it works, but don't worry, in the following videos, we'll be seeing both of these approaches in action. With that being said, let's move on to front-end application development and see how that works. With front-end application development, things are much easier just because we can fully develop locally. Here we're again using the watch command, but this time what the command will do, it will spin up a new dev server on our local machine, which will host our app, so that might be your admin app or website app. And most importantly, as we're making changes to our code, these changes are immediately reflected in our browser. So this makes iteration a lot faster. And there is no need to redeploy anything, as it was the case when we were talking about backend application development. Before moving on to the next slide, we just wanted to note one thing, and that is, despite the fact that front-end application development is a fully local experience, note that these applications are typically relying on a backend API like a GraphQL API or a REST API. In case of Webiny, we have admin and website applications, and these applications rely on a GraphQL API that's being deployed with the core and API project applications. So before you start your front-end development, make sure to have your core and API project applications deployed. And these are the commands we'll need when working with admin and website front-end applications locally. So in both cases, we are using the Webiny watch command, after which we are specifying the name of the application, so it's either admin or website. And finally, we need to also specify the environment we're working with. In this case, it's dev. And that's it. That's really all to it when it comes to front-end application development. As mentioned, when compared to backend development, it's much easier just because there are a lot less moving parts. And again, this was just a brief overview of how front-end application development works, the same way we did it with backend development. And in the following videos, we'll see much more of these commands in action.